the details of biochemistry, molecular biology, you might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
The human genome is about 3 gigabases long, which boils down to 750 megabytes. This is about the same code amount that is found in the total of 3 Mozilla browsers. The language of DNA is digital, but it is not binary code like a computer. Where binary encoding has zeros and ones to work with, DNA has 4 positions, T, C, G, and A. These letters are used to represent the 4 informational nucleotide bases of a DNA strand. Whereas a digital byte is almost 8 binary digits, a DNA byte, called a codon, has 3 digits. Because each digit can have 4 values instead of 2, a DNA codon has 64 possible values, compared to a binary byte which has 256. When you take into account that all 20+ million species of known life and each of their subsystems and sub-subsystems are all produced within this 64-value coding language, you can see the amazing efficiency level at which the genome works. Of the 20,000 to 30,000 genes now thought to make up the human genome, most cells actually express only a very small part of the total information code, which makes sense. A liver cell, for example, would have no need for the DNA code that makes up neurons. But since almost all the cells carry around a full copy of the genome, a system is needed to define out information that is not needed. And that is just how DNA works. Just like a computer program, the genetic code is full of if and end if statements. This is why stem cells are so hot right now. These cells have the ability to differentiate into everything. The code hasn't been defined out yet, so to speak. Stated more precisely, stem cells do not have everything turned on. Over the lifetime of the stem cell, during which time it may clone or fork many times, it specializes itself. Each specialization can be regarded as choosing a branch in a tree, in which it will ultimately and finally operate and specialize. Each stem cell can make or be induced to make decisions about its future. Each decision makes it more specialized. DNA is not simply a computer programming language, but as you have already seen, there are some startling analogies between DNA and computer code. We can view each cell as a CPU, or a central processing unit, running its own kernel. As you probably know, in computing, the kernel is the main component of most computer operating systems. It's a bridge between applications and the actual data processing done at the hardware level. So each cell has a copy of the entire kernel. But amazingly, each cell chooses to activate only the relevant parts, which modules or which driver it loads, so to speak. If a cell needs to do something or call a function, it calls up the right piece of the genome and transcribes it into RNA. The RNA is then translated into a sequence of amino acids, which together make up a protein for which the DNA coded. Now for the truly amazing part of the equation. This called up and coded protein is then tagged with a shipping address. This address is a marker consisting of several amino acids which tells the rest of the cell where this particular protein needs to be deployed. Once the protein arrives at its intended location, the delivery instruction is then stripped off and several post-processing steps are performed, activating the protein to now do its job. The protein is not activated until it arrives at its marked and intended location. The amazing and complex, intelligent communication functions of DNA are myriad. They are too numerous to recount and explain in a short and simple video such as this. But the fact remains, purposed and directed information exchange is continuously conducted within the human genome and the DNA-RNA functions that make it up. Purposed and directed information exchange.
The information that is stored in the DNA molecule is pointing back to a designing intelligence. Now, why do I say that? It has to do with what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world. Our local hero in Seattle, Bill Gates, says that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever created. And that's a very suggestive remark, because we know that programs always come from programmers. And in fact, we know generally that information, whether it's in a computer program or a hieroglyphic inscription or in a headline in a newspaper or a block of text in a book, information always comes from an intelligent source. So when we find information in the DNA molecule, the most logical thing to conclude is that it too had an intelligent source.
As far as I'm concerned, I'm here to tell you, Michael, this morning, and Jason, evolution is dead. Long live the creator. I'll tell you why. And I'm saying science says that as a scientist. Evolution is dead because there's such thing as the minimal gene set concept. They've taken a mycoplasma, smallest organism, Mycoplasma genitalium, which is the smallest organism that is known to exist, has 468 genes. A genes is a mix of proteins, right? A list of, so it can be 1,000, can be 10,000 amino acids. Okay, there are 486, and they've decided since year 2000, they've said, let's try to reduce it. Because we have to start, if you're going to be an evolutionist, you have to start with 0 genes and build up if you're going to go from hydrogen to human. And so, somewhere along the way, they said, well, let's take it down. In the year 2000, they published that even on paper, they couldn't go below 200 genes. On the 6th of January 2006 in Nature, they published that in reality, you could only go down to 397 genes. So a cell, which is where my specialty lies in my scientific work, a cell needs a specific number of components to be functional. You have a membrane, but then you need to feed the membrane. So you have to have some mitochondria. You need a way of tagging the proteins. You need some DNA. So you need 397 things. Just the glucose cycle for getting energy takes over 6 different genes. So if you don't have one of them, you don't have any more energy coming to the cell.
Evolutionists have faith the origin of the digital information in DNA can be explained by abiogenesis. But such an idea is clearly erroneous and contrary to common sense. The information in DNA actually refutes abiogenesis. In fact, after restudying this kind of evidence, the Nobel laureate chemist Richard Smalley recently came to the conclusion that life must have been created by design. Darwinism had a good run, but in light of us discovering these kinds of things Darwin was ignorant of, we need to now move on to the 21st century. Now, some evolutionists have claimed that maybe the first biomolecules were actually composed of RNA instead of amino acids forming themselves into functional proteins, serving as the first enzymes. However, for a refutation of this erroneous idea, see the geneticist Jeffrey Tompkins' essay, The Mystery of Life's Beginnings. For example, he notes, RNA and DNA molecules are composed of 5 nucleobases, 2 sugars, and a phosphate. The nucleobases contain 2 different pyrimidines. Therefore, before an evolutionist even considers the possibility that RNA was the first major biomolecule, he must first explain the origin of these necessary nucleobases. In his essay, he highlights other serious problems as well. Now, the abundance of material challenging abiogenesis has led many high-level evolutionists to admit that they do not know if abiogenesis occurred, or how it could. For example, evolutionist Paul Davies said, "One of the great outstanding scientific mysteries is the origin of life. How did it happen? The truth is, nobody has a clue." In one documentary film, evolutionist Richard Dawkins even claimed, out of desperation, that aliens perhaps seeded life on Earth. This is because Darwinists do not have a clue if or how abiogenesis happened naturally. Indeed, even though many high-level evolutionists admit they do not know if abiogenesis occurred, or if it even could, it is still nevertheless dishonestly taught as fact to the public. Many school textbooks and popular television programs do this. For example, in the 2010 book Philosophy of Biology, popular evolutionist writer Eugenie Scott matter-of-factly claimed, "But at some point in Earth's early history, perhaps as early as 3.8 billion years ago, life in the form of simple single-celled organisms appeared. Once life evolved, biological evolution became possible." Likewise, the popular 2011 National Geographic television documentary, The Story of Earth, although admitting they don't know how it happened, matter-of-factly claimed it did.
The water has become a chemical soup. It's impossible to know how or when, but somehow these chemicals have come together to create life.
It is because such popular books and television programs dishonestly tell people abiogenesis matter-of-factly occurred, even though Darwinists admit they don't know if or how it even could, which is why so many naive people in our society are persuaded to believe abiogenesis.
So do you believe in the theory of evolution?
I do.
Do you believe man evolved from apes?
Yeah, because of biological evidence, I believe that.
Could you be specific about the evidence?
How the planet Earth evolved from heavy particles and matter coming together, and then slowly as it cooled off, single-cell life forms developed in the ocean, and then slowly they evolved into multi-celled organisms, and then eventually into humans.
Did they come out of the sea?
Yeah.
So you think we lived under the water?
It's possible at some point.
When we were under the water, do you think we had lungs or gills? Because I'm trying to think, here is this sort of animal who's coming out of the ocean without lungs. So he comes out with gills, goes, runs back to water and just keeps coming out until lungs develop?
Yeah.
Wow. So do you think we could have evolved from horses?
Sure.
This animal that came out without lungs and breathed and went back in, was he male or female?
I don't know. He could, yeah. He could have been a hermaphrodite.
He was male and female?
Yeah, probably.
And he was alone?
I don't know, could have been.
So he could have been alone?
Could have been alone.
So how did he reproduce?
I don't know. Asexually.
He split in two?
He could have.
Yeah. And this is the evidence that this teacher gave you?
His was a lot more in depth, but I don't remember it all. Sorry.
Do you think God had anything to do with this?
That's an area I have never explored, but it's hard not to believe that sometimes.
Now, Darwinists teach chemical evolution, or abiogenesis. That is, the idea there was an initial self-reproducing single-celled organism that arose due to some natural chemical process, and that this was the first life on Earth from which all other life subsequently evolved. Yet, because this is not science and can't be proved through observation and testing, evolutionists often resort to saying, the origin of life has nothing to do with the theory of evolution. However, evolutionist Gordon Slack rebukes such a cop-out. I think it is disingenuous to argue that the origin of life is irrelevant to evolution. It is no less relevant than the Big Bang is to physics or cosmology. Evolution should be able to explain, in theory at least, all the way back to the very first organism that could replicate itself, through biological and chemical processes. Likewise, zoologist and physiologist Gerald Kirkett defined the general theory of evolution as the theory that all living forms in the world have arisen from a single source, which itself came from an inorganic form. Hence, the erroneous nature of abiogenesis does have an impact on evolutionary theory, despite claims to the contrary. The idea of abiogenesis states that perhaps ammonia, carbon dioxide, water, and other gases at the time of the early Earth were jump-started either by lightning or radiation, which acted as an energy source to somehow form the first single-celled organism, life from non-life. A cell contains, among other things, proteins, which are formed by amino acids. However, scientist Stephen Meyer calculated if one factors in the need for proper bonding and homochirality, the probability of constructing a rather short, functional protein at random becomes so small, 1 chance in 10 to the 125th power, as to approach the universal probability bound of 1 chance in 10 to the 150th power. The point at which appeals to chance become absurd, given the probabilistic resources of the entire universe. Moreover, he calculated that to generate a single functional protein of 150 amino acids exceeds 1 chance in 10 to the 180th power, and notes, "It is extremely unlikely that a random search through all the possible amino acid sequences could generate even a single relatively short functional protein in the time available since the beginning of the universe." In regards to the Darwinist attempts at recreating abiogenesis in the lab, they were unsuccessful. In the 1953 Stanley Miller and Harold Urey experiments, using chemicals and gases to recreate what they thought the environment of the early Earth looked like, and using man-made electric charges, they were only able to produce 6 of the 20 amino acids used in biological proteins of a cell. They were only able to produce the simplest amino acids needed for proteins and not the more complex ones, which can't be created using such techniques. Their systems tended to destroy amino acids as quickly as they were produced. The chirality problem prevented their few simple amino acids from being used in real-life proteins, and while functioning proteins only tolerate left-handed amino acid isomers, such amino acid production results in both left and right-handed amino acid isomers being produced at the same frequency. Hence, man's attempt to recreate abiogenesis is a failure, and actually demonstrated abiogenesis is erroneous. Science writer Greg Easterbrook asks, "If life began unaided under primordial conditions in a natural system containing zero knowledge, then it should be possible, it should be easy, to create life in a laboratory today. But determined attempts have failed. No one has come close." Likewise, biochemist Stuart Pullen observes, "In the scientific journals, scientists routinely dismiss many aspects of the abiogenesis hypothesis as highly improbable. While several amino acids can be created under plausible conditions, proteins cannot be." During Darwin's day, people believed in the spontaneous generation of life from non-living matter on the assumption that the cell was allegedly just a simple lump of albuminous combination of carbon, as Darwin's student Ernst Haeckel suggested. However, as one scientist explains, the cell is an information processing and replicating system of astonishing complexity. This astonishing complexity of the cell is evidence it did not arise naturally. As Stephen Meyer notes, cells employ a complex information processing system to access and express the information stored in DNA, as they use that information to build the proteins and protein machines that they need to stay alive. Scientists attempting to explain the origin of life must explain how both information-rich molecules and the cell's information processing system arose. To imagine a cell with its high information content and the ability to reproduce arose naturally is baseless and impossible. Evolutionist Paul Davies expounds on the problem. Most of the workings of the cell are best described not in terms of material stuff, hardware, but as information or software. Trying to make life by mixing chemicals in a test tube is like soldering switches and wires in an attempt to produce Windows 98. It won't work because it addresses the problem at the wrong conceptual level, which leaves us with a curious conundrum. How did nature fabricate the world's first digital information processor, the original living cell, from the blind chaos of blundering molecules? How did molecular hardware get to write its own software? German origin of life researcher Bernd Olaf Kuppers observed, "The problem of the origin of life is basically equivalent to the problem of biological information." In regards to the nature of the cell's complexity and information, Stephen Meyer elaborates on Francis Crick's sequence hypothesis. The sequence hypothesis suggests that the nucleotide bases in DNA functioned like letters in an alphabet or characters in a machine code. Just as alphabetic letters in a written language may perform a communication function depending on the sequence, so too, Crick reasoned, the nucleotide bases in DNA function in precisely the same way as symbols in a machine code or alphabetic characters in a book. In each case, the arrangement of the characters determines the function of the sequence as a whole. As Dawkins notes, the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like.
Now, if we look at the definition of evolution, we can see that evolution is clearly defined as the gradual development of something, especially from a simple to a more complex form. Folks, in order for something to become more complex, you need to introduce new information. Now, for the sake of simplicity, just realize that in order for evolution to even be possible, evolutionists claim that this new information is introduced through mutations. Now, common sense suggests that mutations are usually negative things, but evolutionists are optimistic and are counting on that rare case where damage will cause information to materialize out of nowhere, just by getting extremely lucky during scrambling of the genetic code. Evolutionists acknowledge that each tiny bit of new information is extraordinarily rare, therefore they say that's why it takes millions and millions and even billions of years to happen on a noticeable scale. Evolutionists depend on mutations to generate new information in their model. That part of the model is a huge problem. The stubborn fact is that no instance of mutation making information has ever been confirmed. Not even in the tiniest increment. Never. Not once. There is not a single field observation or lab finding. The only thing that they've been able to find is a mutation which recombines existing information, or a mutation that results in the loss of information. But they have never found a mutation that resulted in new information being created. Never, ever, not once, not one time has that ever been proven to even be possible. Folks, adding brand new information to the genome essentially is evolution. So if there is no evidence that it has ever happened, there is no evidence for evolution at all. Furthermore, if there is no evidence at all that it is even possible, and no one has ever observed it happening, there is no way to calculate an average time frame for it to occur. You can't develop a mathematical equation to express the time needed for this beneficial mutation that would result in the creation of new information to occur. Meaning, there's no way to know how long it would take, even if it was theoretically possible. So this whole idea of it taking millions or billions of years is literally pulled out of thin air. Now at this point, many of you are probably asking yourselves, what about the fossil record? I'm sure that you have all heard at one point or another during your life that man evolved from ape. And I'm sure that you have been told about all of the different supposed transitional stages of human beings supposedly found linking Homo sapiens to apes or an ape-like creature. And all I have to say about this, folks, is that you really need to do your research. The vast majority of these are admitted and proven frauds, yet are still touted as being true. Let me give you just a few examples. Nebraska man was a name applied to Hesperopithecus Harold Cookie, a putative species of ape. Hesperopithecus meant ape of the Western world, and it was heralded as the first higher primate of North America. Now folks, this discovery of Nebraska man was entirely based on a tooth, one single tooth. And from that tooth, they somehow magically constructed an entire species that conveniently for evolutionists served as one of many necessary missing links needed to serve as evidence for man evolving from ape. Another example is Piltdown man. Now, Piltdown man was originally classified as an Eoanthropus dawsoni. Now, the problem with this particular one is that it was discovered to be a forgery in 1953 and consisted of the lower jawbone of an orangutan deliberately combined with the cranium of a fully developed modern human. Folks, the thing you have to ask yourself is why are there so many frauds surrounding the evolution theory? Statistically speaking, these genetic mutations that result in the creation of new information are extraordinarily rare, meaning that in order for one species to transcend to the next level as the theory of evolution dictates. They would have to cycle through hundreds, probably more like thousands upon thousands, of generations in order for this genetic fluke to occur. My point is this: either these man-like apes should have been around for thousands and thousands of years, or at the given point in time when they did exist, there would have had to have been a huge population of them. In either case, the quote-unquote fossil record should be riddled with these bones. These archaeologists shouldn't be resorting to creating hoaxes in order to gain notoriety and fame for finding the missing link. They should literally be tripping over these things. Another one would be Lucy. Lucy was discovered by a man named Donald Johanson and was found in 1974 in the Awash Valley in Ethiopia. It was classified as an Australopithecus afarensis and only consisted of several hundred pieces of bone, representing only about 40% of the skeleton of this supposed missing link. Now, what is highly suspect about this so-called discovery is that Donald Johanson went to Ethiopia with a grant to find the missing link. Now, just 2 weeks before his grant money expired and ran out, he discovered Lucy. Highly motivated, I suspect. Now, Lucy was 3 feet tall and was obviously a chimpanzee of some kind. Now, the skull was completely crushed, so they could not tell anything about the skull. But when they depict her in museums and in textbooks, they make her appear half human and half ape. The supposed knee joint of Lucy was found over 1.5 miles away and 200 feet deeper, and the hands and feet bones were missing, yet they somehow decide to put human feet on it whenever it's illustrated. Now, one that most of you have probably heard of is Neanderthal man. Neanderthals are generally classified by biologists as the species Homo neanderthalensis. The problem is it has been proven that the Neanderthal cannot possibly be a missing link between man and ape. Neanderthals are actually thought to be superior humans with thicker bones and stronger muscles who actually lived to be very old. They also appear to have a 13% larger brain than modern man. Folks, any way you slice it, Neanderthals are not an intermediate step in the road to create modern man, but can actually be considered one step above modern man. They were smarter, stronger, faster, and bigger than we are today.
If the creatures we see today actually evolved from other kinds of creatures in the past, gradually over long periods of time, we would expect to find in the fossil record their intermediate or transitional forms with halfway structures. There should be innumerable examples of this. However, we do not observe this. Instead, what we find in the fossil record are fully formed fossils, with the exception of a handful of debatable, alleged transitional fossils Darwinists bring up. This is a serious problem for Darwinism. Charles Darwin himself worried about this issue. He wrote, "Why is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against this theory." Around 100 years later, the famous evolutionist author Stephen Jay Gould likewise noted the fossil record does not actually support this Darwinian gradualistic view of evolution. The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates in many cases, has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. And I regard the failure to find a clear vector of progress in life's history as the most puzzling fact of the fossil record. But I also believe that we are now on the verge of a solution, unquote. Indeed, Gould admitted there are serious problems with the fossil record, yet he went on to claim that his punctuated equilibrium idea that evolution occurred through sudden big jumps could solve this problem. However, his proposed solution turned out to be erroneous as well. As Emil Silvestro notes, quote, They, Gould and Eldridge, were not even willing to explain from whence such a massive addition of genetic information could have come. Thus, after Gould's passing away, punctuated equilibrium lost popularity, and gradualistic neo-Darwinism became the ruling dogma in academia again. In his work Darwin's Doubt, Stephen Meyer showed many other problems with punctuated equilibrium as well. Hence, the fossil record problem Gould admitted existed still remains. In light of concerns from such high-level evolutionists as Gould, one should be skeptical towards the popular evolutionary apologists today, who try to claim the lack of intermediate forms in the fossil record is not a serious problem. The fact is that fully formed organisms appear abruptly in the fossil record. For example, the chemist and science writer Jonathan Sarfati notes, the first bats and birds in the fossil record are indeed fully fledged flyers. Moreover, the oldest known turtle in the fossil record is fully formed. We have no intermediates between turtles and cotylosaurs, which are the organisms evolutionists claim turtles supposedly came from. And the quote-unquote imperfection of the fossil record excuse will not work, since organisms like turtles leave excellent fossils but still show no intermediates. This is because macroevolution is a delusion. Although Darwin himself, as well as modern Darwinists today, claim that the reason we do not find these transitional forms is because the fossil record is supposedly imperfect, this attempt at saving face will not work for other reasons as well. John D. Morris notes, extensive exploration and fossil discovery in the following years after Darwin have not brought such in-between forms to light. The vast majority of taxonomic orders and families which live today are also found as fossils, yet without fossil transitions. Indeed, this is confirmed by biochemist Michael Denton, who, in his work Evolution: A Theory in Crisis, showed 97.7% of living orders of land vertebrates are represented as fossils, as well as 79.1% of living families of land vertebrates, 87.8% if birds are excluded, as they are less likely to become fossilized. In fact, all 32 mammal orders appear abruptly and fully formed in the fossil record. So the idea the fossil record is incomplete is false. Now, Darwin also tried to address the transitional fossil problem by claiming the alleged imperfection of the fossil record was, quote, chiefly due to organic beings not inhabiting profound depths of the sea. However, Emil Silvestru notes, this excuse is likewise false, since the idea life did not exist in the depths of the sea has since been disproven. A final word on transitional forms from Sarfati, quote, the inability to imagine functional intermediates is a real problem. If a bat or bird evolved from a land animal, the transitional forms would have forelimbs that were neither good legs nor good wings. So how would such things be selected? The fragile long limbs of hypothetical halfway stages of bats and pterosaurs would seem more like a hindrance than a help, unquote. The Cambrian explosion is a very strong refutation of macroevolution as well. The Cambrian refers to an early period of geologic history. Scientist Stephen Meyer notes, during this geological period, many new and anatomically sophisticated creatures appear suddenly in the sedimentary layers of the geologic column, without any evidence of simpler ancestral forms in the earlier layers below. If macroevolution is true, and these creatures in the Cambrian evolved from simpler forms, the earlier layers below should contain such forms, but they do not. This is a serious problem for Darwinism. Another aspect of the Cambrian explosion is brought out by John D. Morris, quote, the Cambrian explosion constitutes a major episode in the history of life. If evolution were true, one would expect the record to start with one type of animal, then increase to two, and so on. Yet fossil studies have shown that essentially all phyla were present at the start, each distinct from the others, and each fully equipped to function and survive. Even vertebrate fish were present in the Lower Cambrian. There is no evolutionary tree found in the fossils, as Darwin and his disciples have claimed. Rather, it is more like a lawn than a tree. Indeed, this data troubled Charles Darwin a lot, and he admitted it was a very difficult problem for his theory. Even over 100 years later, the evolutionist Professor Geoffrey Levington admitted this is evolution's, quote, deepest paradox, end quote. Moreover, in regards to Darwinian attempts at answering the Cambrian explosion, paleontologist Mark McMenamin conceded, "It is hard for us paleontologists, steeped as we are in the tradition of Darwinian analysis, to admit that neo-Darwinian explanations for the Cambrian explosion have failed miserably. New data acquired in recent years, instead of solving Darwin's dilemma, have rather made it worse. Thus, one should be skeptical when evolution apologists claim the Cambrian explosion is not a problem."
Now this brings me to a problem which should be obvious to anyone who supports the theory of evolution and who also considers themselves to be a scientist. And that is that evolution adamantly and vehemently defies entropy, or in other words, the second law of thermodynamics. This fundamental law clearly expresses that over time things degrade, things become more random, that things decline over time. A common sense way of looking at this, and something that should be obvious, is that we see species go extinct. They don't come into existence. We aren't seeing an increase, we're actually seeing a decrease. In fact, while we're at it, let me just quickly rattle off a few other fundamental scientific principles that evolution violates in one way or another. We've already talked about entropy, but it also violates biogenesis, Mendel's law of genetics, spontaneous generation, law of information systems, specified complexity, irreducible complexity, statistical mathematics, natural law, beneficial mutation, genetic complexity, and information theory. Now folks, I must ask, how on earth can evolution be classified or considered a scientific fact when even at a fundamental level, even if proven possible, does not prove that it actually happened, has never actually even been proven possible scientifically, has been repeatedly discredited through fossil findings and recent research, hangs the majority of its most significant pieces of evidence on proven hoaxes, and defies numerous well-established scientific principles? Folks, at the end of the day, there is absolutely no way to quantify evolution as a fact or a certainty. It is a belief, and a religious one at that. People follow this theory devotedly and base their entire view of the universe and how it works on this theory. And in fact, the saddest and most apparent way that you can see for yourself how devoted the followers of the evolution theory are to this precious belief that they hold in their heart, if you go and look at any video on YouTube that even so much as questions the theory of evolution, and you will find in the comments section a plethora of people attacking the video and the video's creator in a slew of vulgar and grotesque ways, void of any logical basis, solely because their worldview is being crumbled and threatened. It is a belief, it is religious, and if we are not careful, it will be the foundation on which the one world religion is built. Folks, do not believe for 1 second that evolution is somehow fact, and that you must bend your personal religious beliefs around it. Evolution is far from fact, and is actually much closer to fiction. And it's important for me to note here that the pieces of evidence that they conclude are scientifically proven cannot possibly quantify as evolution. And calling them evolution or part of evolution is extremely misleading and deceitful, Adaptation is a much better word than microevolution to explain the subtle changes within a given species of the same kind. Obviously, animals change over time. That's how we're able to breed different types of dogs, or faster racehorses for the Kentucky Derby. That's all done through selective breeding. That has nothing to do with evolution. Now, as we talked about in the beginning of this video, evolution implies the creation of new information. The problem is that every single one of these microevolution cases that they point to in an attempt to solidify their theory all are the result of recombining already existent information or losing information. In none of these is new information being created, which is what is essential for evolution to be true. To explain this on a graph, I've already explained that evolutionists believe that all forms of life evolve, meaning that they are adding complexity, they are adding information. This can be depicted by an upward graph. Now, this is all hypothetical. It has never once been proven in a laboratory setting or in the field. What scientists do observe on a regular basis, however, is the recombining of already existent information, meaning no additional complexity being added, which can be represented by a horizontal line. In other words, variations within the same kind of animal, but all resulting from the same genetic information. Nothing added, nothing subtracted. They also occasionally witness mutations that result in the loss of genetic information. This can be represented by a downward slope, or the loss of complexity, the loss of information. Now, sometimes they try and confuse you, and they will point to something that they claim is a beneficial mutation that is actually the result of losing genetic information. But the way that that works is an organism losing a protein that a virus or bacteria attacks. Therefore, if the organism no longer produces and creates that protein, this virus that was attacking them is no longer able to. And they credit that as a beneficial mutation when in reality, it is the loss of genetic information and cannot possibly quantify as evolution. If anything, it's de-evolution. Now, when we look at these graphs, we know that the creation of new information has never once been observed, tested, or proven, even possible. The horizontal line accurately depicts no information being added or lost, while still creating variations within the same kind of animal. Now, the downward slope, as I described, explains the loss of genetic information. Now, the thing with this is, you can't continue losing genetic information and still see beneficial mutations. The vast majority of the time, when you lose genetic information, it's a negative thing. So yes, while scientists can occasionally point to the loss of genetic information being a benefit to a particular animal, not only is that extraordinarily rare, but it actually shows de-evolution. So when we look at this graph and we see what has been proven and what has never been proven, and we look back at these bones of Neanderthal man being uncovered, well, it begins to seem as though we're actually, in a sense, de-evolving. I mean, after all, that is what the science is indicating. Now, my point is that when somebody comes to you and claims that evolution is scientific fact, you can be rest assured that they clearly don't even understand evolution on an elementary level. Evolution has absolutely no proof to back it up.
Thousands of examples. Can you give me one? I can give you thousands, just one. To summarize, the observable evidence that you give me for Darwinian evolution is bacteria becoming bacteria. Still bacteria, there's no change of claims.
I'm holding a copy of what's called A Scientific Dissent from Darwinism. And it's signed by 300 scientists with doctorates from prestigious universities such as Cambridge, Stanford, Cornell, Yale, Rutgers, Chicago, Princeton, Purdue, Syracuse, Duke, and Berkeley. And they say, quote, "We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for a Darwinian theory should be encouraged." Barry, should we be hiding this from our school kids? Because they're not being told that this kind of stuff exists.
Well, no. Interestingly, the National Center for Science Education recently got 300 people just with the name of Steve or Stephanie to sign a statement talking about how important the teaching of evolution was. So I'm not sure that 300 people, even if some of them are at prestigious universities, make the difference. The difference is
science isn't a popular vote. It's not determined by popular vote. But the fact that there are 300 people with credible degrees is significant, I think.
No, the incredible thing about this debate is that people cannot distinguish between what is religious thinking and religious questions and those that are scientific questions.
I didn't see anything about religion in this particular document by these 300 scientists. But, John, what's your response? What is being taught in our public schools?
Well, I think first we need to be very clear about what the debate is about. In most states, unlike Dover, Pennsylvania, the real debate is not whether to teach alternatives to Darwin's theory, like intelligent design, which I think is scientific, not religious. But the real debate is whether you should teach some of the peer-reviewed scientific criticisms of modern evolutionary theory that actually exists. What's wrong with that?
Well, it's certainly a terrible idea because it suggests something that you would never suggest about the theory of plate tectonics or the theory of relativity or dozens of other theories, and that is you single out evolution and act as if there's some kind of major scientific dispute. And in fact, what you guys that promote intelligent design and the Discovery Institute does that, let's never forget that, is to suggest that because there is not an answer to every single conceivable question about evolution, therefore there's some serious gap, and you're going to fill it in. And what you're going to suggest to do is essentially to fill it in with discussion of God.
First of all, notice how Barry's sort of changing the subject. And there's nothing about intelligent design in what we proposed in Ohio. And in fact, our position at Discovery Institute is that intelligent design should not be required or mandated, that the focus, what students need to learn about, is scientific criticisms of major aspects of evolutionary theory, which is already in the peer-reviewed science journals. If a scientist can read it in a science journal, why can't they read about it in their biology textbook? Now,
Barry, we do support only in one topic.
Well,
why are you only interested in a topic that has this religious overlay and not this?
I turn it around. The problem with evolutionary theory is, unlike all the other scientific theories, whether it be plate tectonics, there you actually do have legitimate discussions that that scientists allow you to have. Evolution, for some people, unfortunately, is almost like their religion. And so you have them claiming that you can't have any scientific criticism of it. The reason why Ohio had to put in its
scientific criticism of the basic idea behind evolution. There, of course,
what is the basic idea
of theory, you're going to have changes. You're going to have the things are going to get better. We're going to know more. There's nothing wrong with that.
But again, the bottom line is, when you go to the science journals, you can read about disputes about whether microevolutionary processes explain these macroevolutionary events. And in a place like Ohio, in the model curriculum lesson plan that was developed by science educators, including state university biologists, that your group opposes, it was talking about these sorts of things that are in the scientific literature.
Barry,
What's the crime, Barry?
For the life of me, I can't understand why a requirement that students be taught to think critically about anything and really to look at both sides and all sides of issues can be a bad thing. I became an atheist when I was in high school because of what I was taught in biology, where I was taught one side in terms of what evolution supposedly proved. I became an atheist as a result of that. Now, I later learned, as I investigated science further, as I investigated science further, I came to a far different conclusion because I learned both sides of the story. For the life of me, I don't understand. Forget intelligent design, forget teaching something else. Why not just teach kids to think critically about this issue?
at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology, you might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
The human genome is about 3 gigabases long, which boils down to 750 megabytes. This is about the same code amount that is found in the total of 3 Mozilla browsers. The language of DNA is digital, but it is not binary code like a computer, where binary encoding has zeros and ones to work with. DNA has 4 positions, T, C, G, and A. These letters are used to represent the 4 informational nucleotide bases of a DNA strand. Whereas a digital byte is almost 8 binary digits, a DNA byte, called a codon, has 3 digits. Because each digit can have 4 values instead of 2, a DNA codon has 64 possible values, compared to a binary byte, which has 256. When you take into account that all 20+ million species of known life and each of their subsystems and sub-subsystems are all produced within this 64-value coding language, you can see the amazing efficiency level at which the genome works. Of the 20,000 to 30,000 genes now thought to make up the human genome, most cells actually express only a very small part of the total information code, which makes sense. A liver cell, for example, would have no need for the DNA code that makes up neurons. But since almost all the cells carry around a full copy of the genome, a system is needed to define out information that is not needed. And that is just how DNA works. Just like a computer program, the genetic code is full of if and end if statements. This is why stem cells are so hot right now. These cells have the ability to differentiate into everything. The code hasn't been defined out yet, so to speak. Stated more precisely, stem cells do not have everything turned on. Over the lifetime of the stem cell, during which time it may clone or fork many times, it specializes itself. Each specialization can be regarded as choosing a branch in a tree, in which it will ultimately and finally operate and specialize. Each stem cell can make or be induced to make decisions about its future. Each decision makes it more specialized. DNA is not simply a computer programming language, but as you have already seen, there are some startling analogies between DNA and computer code. We can view each cell as a CPU, or a central processing unit, running its own kernel. As you probably know, in computing, the kernel is the main component of most computer operating systems. It's a bridge between applications and the actual data processing done at the hardware level. So each cell has a copy of the entire kernel. But amazingly, each cell chooses to activate only the relevant parts, which modules or which driver it loads, so to speak. If a cell needs to do something or call a function, it calls up the right piece of the genome and transcribes it into RNA. The RNA is then translated into a sequence of amino acids, which together make up a protein for which the DNA coded. Now for the truly amazing part of the equation. This called up and coded protein is then tagged with a shipping address. This address is a marker consisting of several amino acids which tells the rest of the cell where this particular protein needs to be deployed. Once the protein arrives at its intended location, the delivery instruction is then stripped off and several post-processing steps are performed, activating the protein to now do its job. The protein is not activated until it arrives at its marked and intended location. The amazing and complex, intelligent communication functions of DNA are myriad. They are too numerous to recount and explain in a short and simple video such as this. But the fact remains, purposed and directed information exchange is continuously conducted within the human genome and the DNA-RNA functions that make it up. Purposed and directed information exchange.